Say you wanted a measure of the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country's borders during a specific period. Where do you look? You might have said GDP, the gross domestic product. This is what most people would say, but it's wrong. And I'm going to tell you what number to use instead. First of all, how do we get GDP? Well, GDP is calculated as C plus I plus G plus X minus M, where C is private consumption, I is private investment, G is government spending on goods and services, X is exports, and M is imports. This is the formula you'll find in every economics textbook, and it's straight out of the Keynesian playbook. Keynesians believe that boosting any part of this equation boosts the economy. So to them, government spending, G, is just as productive as private investment, I, or consumption, C. If the government borrows $1 trillion to dig holes and then fills them back up again, the Keynesians say, GDP goes up, success. But Austrian economists reject this idea. Right away we see there's a problem. This is an aggregate which ignores the structure of production. Austrian economists are deeply skeptical of macroeconomic aggregates that conceal the essential processes of capital structure, entrepreneurial calculation, and time preference. But let's put that aside for now and look at another formula. The gross national product, or GNP. GNP is calculated by taking the GDP, which you just learned the formula for, and adding NFI, or net factor income from abroad, which is income from domestically owned assets abroad minus income paid to foreignly owned assets domestically. This is a more comprehensive number as it measures total income earned by a nation's residents, including foreign earnings. So does that mean we should use GNP instead of GDP? No. Because GNP doesn't solve the second fundamental flaw of GDP, which is that it includes coercive, non-market government spending. It includes government output as though that was productive, when in fact it is robbing people of choice and ignores time preferences and the subjective nature of value as an individual ranking. Robert Beta Marco summarized Rothbard nicely, quote, "The only way economists can place a monetary value on some commodity is by observing an individual voluntarily exchanging a certain amount of his own money for that commodity. A person who pays $20 for a shirt reveals that he values the shirt more than he values the $20. Because government output is, with few exceptions, not sold on the market, one cannot accurately measure its value. Furthermore, the fact that such output must be financed coercively through taxation creates at least a presumption that those unwilling to pay for such output do not place any value on it." End quote. Government does not add to society. It is a parasite on the productive economy, period. Now you might say, all right, Donald, fine. If the problem with GDP is the government part of the equation, then we can just drop that part and essentially fix GDP, right? Well, no. And that brings us to our third formula, gross private product, GPP. GPP is what you get when you take GNP and subtract government and government enterprise income. But it does not fix GDP, as it does not account for the ongoing burden of taxation and debt financing that drains private production even if the government has nothing to show for. What we really want to know is what is left to the private sector. What is left to the productive people of a country? For that, we need the private product remaining, or PPR. To get the PPR, we take the GPP and we subtract government interest receipts, as well as either government expenditures or total tax revenues, whichever is higher. Why whichever is higher? Because whether the government is taxing more than it spends or spending more than it taxes, the private sector pays either way. If the state runs a deficit, it borrows, which many economists describe as crowding out private savings. But from the Austrian perspective, the issue runs deeper. Government borrowing doesn't just reduce available funds for private investment, it misallocates capital entirely, diverting it from productive voluntary enterprise into political projects chosen without regard to market prices or consumer preferences. If it runs a surplus, it overtaxes and hoards, forcibly extracting resources that could have been used to satisfy genuine, demonstrated wants. Either way, it drains resources from the voluntary sector of the economy. So to fully capture the burden of the state, we subtract the larger of the two, spending or taxes. Suppose there were a very simple economy, in which farmers produced 1,000 bushels of wheat and the government collected 200 bushels in taxes to support workers. GNP would be 1,200 bushels, private output plus costs of producing government output. GPP would be 1,000 bushels, and PPR would be 800 bushels. Private product remaining measures the amount of market-based production remaining in private hands after government drains the economy through spending and taxing. It's still an aggregate that obscures production structure, but this is the Austrian economist's preferred national product measure and the way you ought to think of a country's true productivity.